The United States stands today as the dominant global power, with the world's largest economy and the most advanced military force in history. Its path to supremacy was shaped by geography, abundant natural resources, and the ability to transform these assets into industrial and technological strength. To put this into perspective, there are US states that, if they were to become independent, would be among the top 10 largest economies in the world, such as Texas and California. The United States allocates more resources to its defense arsenal than any other country in history, and adding the rest of the top 5, they still wouldn't cover a quarter of what America spends. The US boasts the most fearsome arsenal ever assembled. Its nuclear stockpile of approximately 3,700 active warheads is backed by a triad of intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched missiles, and long-range bombers that allow it to annihilate any adversary in a matter of hours. Its navy dominates the oceans with 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers and hundreds of warships and submarines, projecting its might to every corner of the globe. The United States also produces some of the world's most talented individuals, innovators, thinkers and professionals, occupying almost all the positions in the world's 10 most prestigious universities. 8 of the 10 largest companies on the planet are American. For over a century, America has shaped global politics with the weight of an empire. Washington has acted as judge, jury and executioner on the world stage, orchestrating coups in Latin America and the Middle East, toppling governments and installing regimes that served its interests. It carved its territory from the lands of Mexico and native nations, secured oil and influence in the Middle East, and projected force where rivals once stood. In the First and Second World Wars, it entered late yet decisively, tilting the balance without suffering the devastation of Europe or Asia. Afterward, it claimed a place at the top, contesting the Soviet Union in a struggle for global supremacy. Even beyond politics and war, America imposes its will. Its films, music, fashion and technology set the rhythm of modern life. For all intents and purposes, the United States serves as the empire of the modern age. It speaks and the world obeys. But what made a nation born of migrants become the undisputed king of the 20th century, and even the 21st? Today we'll explore how the United States became so powerful. Long before the United States declared its independence and existed as a nation, American lands were occupied by Native Americans. The British colonization of America began in the late 16th century, when England, seeking to expand its influence and resources, authorized explorers such as Sir Humphrey Gilbert and Sir Walter Raleigh to establish settlements on the American continent. However, these early attempts, such as the failed Roanoke colony, did not last. Jamestown, Virginia, the first permanent English settlement in North America, was founded in 1607 by the London Company. Other settlements followed, such as Plymouth in 1620, founded by the Puritan Pilgrims, and Massachusetts in 1630. The colonies developed under different motivations, some for economic reasons, others for religious freedom, and still others in the search for new opportunities. The colonial economy was based on agriculture, with crops such as tobacco, rice and cotton in the south, while the north was dedicated to fishing, trade and the production of naval materials. As the population grew, so did the need for land, leading to westward expansion, which came into conflict with the indigenous nations that inhabited those regions. These tensions, combined with disputes over governance, trade and territorial control, escalated into the 7 Years' War, lasting from 1756 to 1763, in which Britain defeated France and seized vast lands across North America, leaving indigenous nations dispossessed and fractured. The war's enormous cost prompted Britain to impose taxes and regulations on the colonies, fueling resentment and protest that drew on decades of experience with self-governance, militias, and frontier survival. These protests quickly evolved into open rebellion, reflecting a population shaped not only by European ideas of liberty, but also by a culture forged in conflict, negotiation, and conquest. The violence and displacement that marked the expansion of the colonies, the massacres, the wars with native nations, and the enforcement of labor through slavery established patterns of power, resistance, and exploitation that would continue to define the young nation. By 1776, after years of armed struggle, political maneuvering and deep social tensions, the 13 colonies declared independence. This act laid the foundation for the United States, a country born out of both ideals and oppression, whose culture and identity were profoundly shaped by the compromises, conflicts, and moral ambiguities of its formation. How did a republic become a superpower shaping nations, toppling governments and ruling seas, skies and cyberspace? Feared for its bombs, adored for its culture. After the Revolutionary War, the 13 colonies had expanded enormously in 80 years. Taking advantage of the early industrial development of a fertile and resource-rich land, the United States developed a robust arms industry that enabled it to seize a significant portion of the territory of the newly founded Mexican Republic. The Mexican-American War ended in 1848, and by the time it was over, the US had taken control of the territory that today occupies California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Wyoming, Kansas, and Oklahoma. It's also worth noting that Texas had been surrendered to the United States 3 years earlier, which sparked the war. After the conflict, the US only paid $15 million to Mexico, which, when adjusted to inflation, is equivalent to just $600 million, a literally ridiculous sum, making it one of the most profitable wars of all time. The US-Mexico War secured for the United States over 2.1 million square kilometers of land. To put it in perspective, this annexation expanded America's territory by nearly 55%, granting control over vast gold deposits, fertile land, and Pacific trade routes, while reducing Mexico by almost half its size and altering the demographic and strategic balance of the continent forever. It was a turning point that redefined the whole continent's geopolitical landscape. The annexation provided vast space for millions of settlers, accelerating population growth and industrial expansion while securing ports and natural barriers that cemented the United States as the hegemon of the Western Hemisphere. It's no surprise that today the USA is one of the leading producers of coal and rare materials like uranium, as well as gold and silver. This, of course, is also due to the most successful deal in history, the US purchase of Alaska. But more about that later. With such extensive resource management, the United States has never been concerned with controlling territories in different parts of the world, as many European countries have done, because in its lands, which once belonged to Mexico, it finds all the necessary resources to thrive. Therefore, instead of colonizing, it is content with simple strategic military bases scattered around specific points in the world, thus saving an enormous amount of expenses. Of course, this is in addition to the most profitable purchase of all time. The deal between Russia and the United States for the purchase of Alaska for just $7.2 million. Alaska was sold by the Russian Empire to the United States due to the Crimean War, a war in which Russia was defeated by the United Kingdom, France, and the Ottomans. This made it clear that Russia would be unable to protect Alaska if its rivals, who were occupying Canada at the time, tried to seize it. Thus, Alexander II decided to sell Alaska urgently, so as not to lose any of the land's value, as they had no troops in a territory that was so difficult to sustain at the time. On March 30th, 1867, Russia sold Alaska for $7.2 million, a sum that was practically symbolic. This was, without a doubt, the most profitable deal and purchase of all time. 30 years after its purchase, the United States began to discover oil and important minerals such as gold, as well as a vast expanse of natural resources and a strategic gateway to the Arctic, offering a direct window to Russia. Alaska has millions of barrels of oil, making it one of the richest states in the world today. Having two extremely active military stations, the Arctic is one of the most significant military protection locations for the United States and among the privileged nations having access to it. After the great territorial expansions of the United States, the nation turned inward and transformed itself. Politically, the Civil War, which lasted from 1861 to 1865, arose from the unresolved contradiction between a republic founded on liberty and a South built on slavery. Although it cost more American lives than any other conflict, its aftermath abolished slavery, reaffirmed federal supremacy over the states, and forged a stronger national identity, giving the republic both cohesion and legitimacy to project power abroad. Economically, the Industrial Revolution accelerated after the Civil War, with railroads linking the continent, the oil and steel industries booming, and U.S. industrial protectionist policies removing tariffs that had previously favored U.S. producers over imported goods, but which had stagnated production and quality in many markets. All advantages that would soon make the United States the world's leading producer of goods. Militarily, the end of continental conquest redirected ambitions outward, and in 1898 the Spanish-American War marked the arrival of a new empire, granting control of the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam and Cuba, advantages that transformed the United States from a continental power to a global one, with the resources, unity and reach to shape the 20th century. This had a lot to do with the fact that the United States, unlike Europe, didn't have to deal with a society that had accumulated so much hatred after the Civil War. In the nations of Europe, absolute monarchies had fostered feelings and sensations of discontent for decades. The reason was that the United States based its government on democracy, a concept that to this day seems to be America's core identity. Or at least that's the face it wishes to present to the world. Although black people and women were not allowed to vote until decades later, on a practical level, democracy allowed America's presidents to undo what other presidents had done if it wasn't an action that stimulated the economy. And so, protectionist economic policies and state interventions began to move aside to create an entrepreneurial spirit. How? The United States implemented patent law, which allowed entrepreneurs to directly benefit from their creations for a period of time determined by law. Although today it seems completely taken for granted, in the 19th century, intellectual property was just in its infancy. But beyond the vast amount of resources in its lands, or the entrepreneurial spirit of its population, the United States' true advantage was its way of conducting trade relations. The nation didn't care what other countries did or didn't do. Isolated from the other great powers, trade negotiations between the United States were about closing deals, not making friends or enemies. The United States didn't ask, didn't judge. It simply offered as much as it could and bought as much as was needed. Thus, isolated from all international conflicts, enemy countries ended up buying from the same bidder, the United States. And of course, moral qualms didn't exist, nor did political stances. Slowly but surely, the United States became the country with the largest number of economic transactions in the world, a position that China holds today. In comparison, the United States found it far more profitable to intensify its processes, bases and production than to accumulate colonies all around the world. While old Europe divided Africa like a cake, the United States only looked the other way and sold when Europeans needed it in their conquests. In just a matter of decades, America had transformed into the world's largest industrial power, requiring a large labor force. Therefore, thousands of migrants from different parts of the world, but especially from Europe, found the perfect opportunity to find abundance in the United States, since by this point, Americans were already richer than average. How would this wealth and power be managed? The industrial titans of the Gilded Age, men like John D. Rockefeller, who built the Standard Oil monopoly and controlled the lifeblood of modern industry, Andrew Carnegie, who mastered steel and supplied the material basis for railroads, bridges and skyscrapers, and J.P. Morgan, the banker who stabilized markets, bailed out the treasury, and bent the financial system to his will, amassed fortunes so vast they rivaled the treasuries of nations, and their influence extended directly into the halls of Washington. Behind the facade of democracy, industrial monopolies dictated policy, banks pulled the strings, and a new elite quietly shaped the nation's future, the first generation of America's leaders. By then, The United States had entered a phase in which its wealth was so immense, its corporations so entrenched, and its appetite for markets so insatiable, that war and diplomacy were becoming tools of the same machine. The next great event was not territorial conquest, but preparation for global dominance. The First World War, from 1914 to 1918, erupted from a web of imperial rivalries that plunged Europe into total war after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. What began as a continental conflict quickly escalated into a global struggle, dragging in empires from every corner of the world. The United States initially stood on the sidelines, its leaders proclaiming neutrality while its industries quietly armed and supplied the Entente powers. But neutrality was an illusion. JP Morgan extended billions of dollars in loans to Britain and France, ensuring that if the Allies lost, Wall Street would collapse with them. The nation's railroads, powered by Carnegie's steel, and ships fueled by Rockefeller's oil, became arteries of war, transporting goods, weapons and credit across the Atlantic. By 1917, unrestricted German submarine warfare and the infamous Zimmermann telegram tipped the balance, drawing the United States openly into the conflict. The American Expeditionary Force, under General John J. Pershing, landed in Europe with more than 2 million troops, breaking the stalemate on the Western Front. American industry mobilized on an unprecedented scale, transforming farms and factories into engines of war production. Economically, the United States emerged as the world's largest creditor nation, overtaking British financial supremacy. Politically, President Woodrow Wilson positioned himself as the leading global authority with his 14 points, while militarily, the weight of American men and material indicated that the United States was no longer a continental power, but a major force in world affairs. The 1920s began with the Red Scare and a rise of isolationism, as Americans refused to get involved abroad while suppressing suspected radicals at home. Prohibition turned the country into a laboratory for organized crime, with figures like Al Capone emerging as symbols of lawlessness, while at the same time the economy flourished even more than before. Henry Ford's mass production of automobiles, the expansion of electricity and consumer goods transformed everyday life, while Wall Street flourished in a speculative frenzy. Multiple transformations occurred. African Americans migrated north in search of opportunity but faced racism. Women gained the right to vote but struggled for greater equality. And farmers saw little of the prosperity enjoyed in the cities. The illusion of endless growth ended abruptly in 1929 with the Wall Street crash, plunging the United States into the Great Depression and marking the collapse of the Roaring Twenties. The worst economic crisis in US history came with the 1929 crash, devastating the nation as unemployment soared to 25% and millions lost homes, savings and livelihoods. For a country long rising in economic and military power, the shock opened the way for Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, a sweeping political and economic shift that regulated finance and created millions of public works jobs. Yet despite these efforts, the New Deal was not what truly saved the United States. Unemployment remained a concern, and industry was just beginning to recover. So when September 1939 arrived, the United States' situation in the face of World War II was uncertain. Although the United States was beginning to regain stability thanks to the New Deal, the war was becoming too intense in Europe and leaving millions dead, so the US government was hesitant to enter the conflict. But if there's one thing that has to be acknowledged, it's that the war presented the US government with yet another fantastic chance. All of the Allied powers in Europe required assistance following the fall of France and the German occupation, and America was able to provide it. Roosevelt signed a Lend-Lease agreement with all the Allied nations. The United States would administer military equipment, raw materials, and other assets from the warring countries, provided that once the war was over, they would be returned or fully compensated to each country. Thus, taking advantage of the uncertainty of the war, the US received the largest credit in human history into its piggy bank, with the sole condition of becoming the world's producer, the producer of war. 90 days after this treaty, Operation Barbarossa began, with the Germans seeking to occupy the territory of the Soviet Union. American industry began producing at maximum volume the weapons and financial resources needed for the Soviets, as they lacked the resources to sustain a prolonged war with Germany. The USSR received more than 14,000 aircraft and nearly 10,000 tanks, as well as a vast amount of railway equipment and essential materials for industrial construction and repair. With this action, the United States completely said goodbye to its employment crisis and stagnant economy. December 1941. The United States continued to manufacture at maximum capacity for the Allied countries, and then Pearl Harbor happened. The American giant entered the war as a result of the Japanese attack on a military installation in Hawaii. Despite being officially neutral, the nation was already involved in the war, with convoys traversing the Atlantic. Pearl Harbor was the ideal war scenario, since it was a dramatic strike that shocked the public and dispelled any political opposition to joining the war. With all the Allied resources at its disposal, the US had been waiting for the right moment to enter the war to secure international markets, demonstrate naval superiority in the Pacific against Japan, and guarantee that Washington, not London or Moscow, would establish the new global order after the war. There, the American machinery grew even further, something so massive that no other country, government or empire had ever achieved before. All thanks to the War Production Act, which, under the conditions of conflict, allowed the government to control civilian industries and redirect them toward the military industry according to the needs and types of production carried out in different companies. Factories that had previously mass-produced automobiles now did the same, but with tanks, ships and airplanes. General Motors created engines for airplanes and vehicles. Boeing built the B-17 and B-29 bombers, Lockheed the P-38 Lightning, North American the P-51 Mustang, and Grumman carrier-based fighters for the Pacific. On the ground, Ford mass-produced the B-24 bombers and vehicles, and Chrysler mass-produced the Sherman tanks. The strategy to finance this massive increase in production was Machiavellian but precise, using loans requested from American companies and even from citizens themselves, with an impeccable marketing strategy, one that has been a hallmark of the United States, its war propaganda. The US government turned patriotism into economics with a massive war bond campaign. Propaganda in theaters, radio and newspapers framed bonds as a moral duty. Celebrities like Rita Hayworth and Babe Ruth urged citizens to back the attack, and communities competed to surpass quotas. Blending fear, pride and star power, Washington made buying bonds inseparable from the war effort. Uncle Sam was happier than ever. This, combined with an increase in taxes that were now levied directly on personal paychecks, meant that aircraft production rose from 19,000 units annually to 96,000. A Jeep was produced every 9 seconds, and a cargo ship was produced in less than a week. But above all, the most important aspect, and what would make the United States the biggest beneficiary of the war, was the nuclear program. The Manhattan Project.
An American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT.
The sky in front of me lit up like nothing you have ever seen.
Greatest weapon ever developed, the atomic bomb.
We have now added a new and revolutionary increase in destruction.
The explosion was a big ball of fire.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
Launched in 1942, the Manhattan Project was a top-secret American program to develop nuclear weapons in the midst of World War II. It mobilized the country's foremost scientists, including Oppenheimer, Fermi, and the influential Einstein, in hidden locations like Los Alamos and Oak Ridge. By 1945, it had dropped the first atomic bombs, forever altering the nature of global politics. The project involved 130,000 people and $2 billion, culminating in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, which wiped two cities off the map. The nuclear bombings of Japan killed an estimated 140,000 and 70,000 people, respectively. By the end of 1945, tens of thousands more died in the following years from burns, radiation sickness, and cancer. For the first time, a nation had the power to flatten entire cities in seconds, and the United States cemented its image as both liberator and executioner. This unprecedented display of power ushered in the nuclear age, where fear became the ultimate weapon. In the following years, the United States accumulated nearly 30,000 nuclear warheads at its peak, an arsenal capable of annihilating humanity many times over, before gradually dismantling them under international treaties. Atomic bombs remain a privilege accessible only to the geopolitical elite, as the ability to reduce anything to ash and render the land infertile is the ultimate bargaining chip. There's a saying that he who has the power to destroy something has control over it, and at that moment the United States demonstrated this with Japan's unconditional surrender. The US lost a military base, Japan lost two entire cities, and suffered a historical trauma that marked the culture of an entire country. In order to maintain peace and stability following World War II, new organizations were established, including the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, which were both established at Bretton Woods in 1944 and the United Nations in 1945. Despite having an international name, these groups were founded under US supervision, with Washington influencing their funding, objectives, and organizational structures. In addition to projecting moral authority, the US used its veto power in the Security Council to defend its allies at the UN. The IMF and the World Bank were designed to stabilize economies and rebuild nations. However, their loans often came with conditions that reinforced US economic dominance, requiring austerity measures and opening markets to Western capital. In practice, these institutions have been far from neutral. The UN failed to prevent or stop atrocities such as the 1994 Rwandan genocide, despite having peacekeepers on the ground, while IMF and World Bank programs have been accused of exacerbating poverty in Latin America and Africa by prioritizing debt repayment over human needs. The Cold War emerged in 1945 from the ruins of World War II, when the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as victors. The United States championed liberal democracy and capitalism, promising free markets and political freedoms, while the Soviet Union championed communism, a one-party system based on state control of the economy and the rejection of Western influence. These worldviews clashed violently in Korea, where the United States led UN forces against the Communist North, backed by China and the USSR, ending in a stalemate that still divides the peninsula. The conflict deepened in Vietnam, where the United States committed men and machines to halt communist expansion in Southeast Asia. Despite years of devastating war, it was drawn in 1973 in what remains one of its greatest military failures. The most dangerous moment came in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis, when US reconnaissance revealed Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. For 13 days, the world teetered on the brink of annihilation as Washington and Moscow traded threats before an agreement withdrawing missiles from both Cuba and Turkey saved humanity from the abyss. Taken together, these conflicts and crises revealed the lengths to which each side would go to defend its system, turning the planet into a chessboard where ideologies were contested, armies clashed, coups were attempted, and brinkmanship prevailed. The space race became a new battlefield, culminating in the 1969 moon landing. A triumph of technology, but also a spectacle of political theatre, raising questions about the billions invested in rockets, while civil rights struggles and poverty ravaged American streets. At the national level, the Cold War transformed the country itself. The military-industrial complex became permanent, established universities became defence research branches, and the services, once oriented toward peacetime life, transport, energy and communications, were restructured for strategy, surveillance and global reach. The CIA became the invisible hand of American foreign policy during the 20th and early 21st centuries, equipping rebels, financing militants and overthrowing regimes in the name of defending democracy. In reality, a significant number of these activities empowered governments and organizations that would later prove to be Washington's greatest adversaries. The agency's clandestine operations, which ranged from arming anti-communist death squads in Latin America to training the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, who later became the Taliban, made it difficult to distinguish between terrorism and liberation. The story has evolved, but the reasoning remains the same today. The war on drugs and the war on terror are now used as moral shields for influence in Latin America and the Middle East, where communism once justified action. Here are some of the most important interventions from the US. In 1893, the US backed a coup against Queen Liliuokalani of the Hawaiian Kingdom, framing it as a local revolt, but with the aim of protecting American sugar interests and securing a Pacific naval base. US Marines and Minister John L. Stevens ensured the monarchy's fall, clearing the path for annexation. In 1903, the United States backed Panama's break from Colombia, portraying it as a self-determination movement, while covertly it was meant to gain control of the Panama Canal. With US warships blocking Colombian troops and swift diplomatic support, Washington guaranteed Panama's independence and its own dominance over the canal. In 1953, the CIA orchestrated a coup against Iran's Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh publicly to restore stability, but in reality to regain Western control over Iranian oil. Operation TP Ajax, confirmed by declassified files, toppled a democratic leader and reinstated the Shah. A year later, in Guatemala 1954, the US ousted President Jacobo Arbenz, citing communist threats while protecting United Fruit Company's interests through Operation PB Success. In the Congo from 1960 to 1961, Washington and Brussels helped remove and assassinate Patrice Lumumba, fearing his nationalist government might align with Moscow and seize Katanga's mineral wealth. By 1963, in South Vietnam, the US backed the coup that killed Ngo Dinh Diem, claiming to restore order. However, the hidden motive was reconfiguring Vietnam's leadership to fit American policy in Southeast Asia. In the late 1950s and 1960s, the US, through the CIA, orchestrated and backed multiple coups in Laos, claiming to stabilize the region. Off the record, these actions were aimed at containing communism and securing strategic routes during the Vietnam War, turning Laos into one of the most heavily bombed nations in history. In 1964, the US backed the coup against Brazil's President João Goulart, claiming to restore order, but truly to block leftist reforms and secure American economic influence. Declassified files confirm CIA involvement. In Indonesia, from 1965 to 1966, Washington supported General Suharto's rise after a bloody purge of communists, removing the left-leaning Sukarno and installing a pro-Western regime. US records now show direct awareness and approval. In Greece, 1967, the US tolerated the colonel's junta, justifying it as protection from communism while preserving NATO control in the region. And in Chile, 1973, the CIA's Project Fubelt helped overthrow Salvador Allende, whose socialist policies threatened US corporate and Cold War interests, ending with Allende's death and Pinochet's brutal dictatorship. In Argentina and across South America during the 1970s, the US supported Operation Condor, a coordinated campaign of right-wing dictatorships that overthrew and hunted leftist movements under the guise of fighting subversion. Declassified CIA and state records show US intelligence and diplomatic backing. In Bolivia, 1971, the US aided Hugo Banzer's coup against leftist Juan José Torres, installing a staunchly pro-American regime. By 1989, Washington launched Operation Just Cause in Panama, invading to remove Manuel Noriega publicly for drug trafficking. The US's true goal was to reassert control over the canal and eliminate an unreliable ally. In Venezuela, 2002, the brief coup against Hugo Chavez bore signs of indirect US involvement through opposition funding, though Washington denied direct action. The same pattern extended to Iraq, from covert Cold War influence in the 1963 Ba'athist coup to the full-scale 2003 invasion that toppled Saddam Hussein, marking the shift from hidden manipulation to open domination. 9 of the world's 10 largest corporations are American, and the country hosts more billionaires than any other. Men so rich that a fraction of their wealth could end world hunger without dethroning them. Through money, power and culture, the US built an empire without colonies, shaping how the world thinks, dresses and dreams through its films, brands and technology. Yet beneath that brilliance lies a contradiction. A nation that praises freedom while exporting war, innovation while fueling consumption, and distraction over reflection. The same country that awards peace prizes to warmongers has turned entertainment and social media into tools of control, making truth optional and the illusion of happiness essential. Perhaps many of us may live long enough to see the American empire fall, as we now witness the rise of other huge economies around the world and the social divisions plaguing America. Only the future will know whether the eagle will continue to spread its wings over the world, or, as in history, all empires fall. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you all for watching. If there's a historical figure you'd like to see featured next, or if you have any thoughts to share, feel free to leave a comment below. I'll see you in the next video.